Upper-class honor is not a toy for people like you.
You are not here to win, Mr. Thorne. You are here to answer. Those were the words I whispered to myself as I watched Julian Thorne adjust his silk tie in the center of my courtroom at the Los Angeles Superior Court. He didn't look like a man seeking justice. He looked like a man seeking a trophy. Julian Thorne was 52 years old, with silver hair swept back perfectly in a suit that likely cost more than the annual salary of the woman sitting across from him. He had a jawline that seemed carved out of arrogance and eyes that moved around the room as if he were checking the price tags on the furniture. I am Judge Simpson. I have sat on this bench for 30 years, and during that time, I have learned that the loudest voice in the room is rarely the one telling the truth. That morning, the courtroom air felt heavy, like a storm was held behind the windows. My clerk's fingers were poised over her keyboard, and the bailiff stood like a stone pillar beside me. Everyone can feel it, the tension that comes when power meets a wall it cannot climb over. The woman Julian Thorne was trying to crush was Sarah Miller, a 29-year-old kindergarten teacher with tired eyes and hands that wouldn't stop shaking. She wore a simple cardigan and held a small notepad like it was a shield. She wasn't a high-powered executive or a celebrity. She was a woman who had worked 60-hour weeks to take care of children, only to find herself sued for defamation by a man whose ego was as large as his bank account. Julian Thorne didn't just walk to the lectern, he conquered it. He leaned in, smelling of expensive tobacco and old money, and looked at Sarah Miller with a smirk that made my skin crawl. He began his opening statement not with facts, but with fire. He spoke about his client's impeccable standing and how people of a certain class shouldn't have to endure the whims of the unwashed. I sat back, my hands folded, watching the way he paced. I've seen this performance 1,000 times. The simulated authority of a man who thinks his billing rate is the same thing as the law. But in my court, the law is the only thing that speaks. Julian Thorne was about to learn that you can buy a suit, you can buy a reputation, but you cannot buy the truth from Judge Simpson. We were only minutes away from a moment that would go viral, a moment that would leave the entire gallery breathless, and I was holding the gavel that would bring his world crashing down. Julian Thorne began his defense with a smile that was as polished as his shoes, the kind of smile that belongs to a man who believes that the truth is just another commodity he can negotiate. He stood in the center of my courtroom, his silk suit catching the light, radiating the scent of expensive tobacco and unearned confidence. He didn't come here to seek justice. He came to execute a social assassination. To him, Sarah Miller wasn't a person. She was an obstacle to be cleared from the path of his illustrious client. Your Honor, Thorne began, his voice a calculated baritone that dripped with condescension. This case is not merely about a few words exchanged on a digital platform. This is about the sanctity of a reputation that took a lifetime to build. And yet, this woman, this Ms. Miller, honestly believed she had the right to dismantle a legacy with cheap, envious slanders. It is a classic case of a small person trying to feel big by pulling a giant down to her level. He turned suddenly, fixing his gaze on Sarah Miller. It wasn't a look of inquiry, it was a predator's stare. I watched Sarah flinch, her fingers tightening around her notepad until her knuckles turned white. Thorne didn't stop. He began to pick through her life, twisting her history as a dedicated teacher into a narrative of mental instability and bitterness. He painted her as a woman who was unfit to be around children, suggesting her accusations were nothing more than a desperate attempt to extort a man of high standing. As I sat there, I felt the air in the gallery shift. This was the emotional kill zone. In my 30 years on the bench, I've seen this tactic 1,000 times. The powerful using their resources to make the victim feel like the criminal. Thorne was checking his heavy gold watch, pacing the floor with the rhythm of a man who thought his time was more valuable than the law itself. He used complex legal jargon not to clarify the facts, but to build a wall of confusion around the truth, hoping to bury Sarah under the weight of his superior intellect. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the soft sob that escaped Sarah's throat. A single tear tracked down her cheek, disappearing into the collar of her simple cardigan. She looked so small sitting there, a lone figure in a sea of expensive suits and cold procedures. Thorne leaned over the defense table, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper that carried to the back row. We are asking for a judgment that reflects the damage done. We are asking for millions, because people like Ms. Miller need to learn that the honor of the upper class is not a toy for their amusement. He looked up at me then, expecting a nod of agreement, a silent pact between men of authority, but he found none. I looked at the way he stood, his chest puffed out, his hand resting casually on the mahogany rail as if he owned the building. He was a master of simulated authority, but he had forgotten one thing. In this room, the only badge of honor that matters is integrity. Mr. Thorne, I said, my voice low and steady, vibrating with a hardness that made the gallery sit up straighter. I have heard quite enough about upper-class honor for one morning. In this courtroom, the only thing with high standing is the evidence. If you continue to use this lectern to assassinate the character of a citizen instead of presenting a single verifiable fact, I will find you in contempt and strip you of your right to speak. Thorne froze. The smirk didn't just fade, it disintegrated. He had spent his career being feared, but he had never been truly judged. And as he looked into my eyes, he realized that for the first time in his life, his money had no power here. Julian Thorne did not take my warning well. His face shifted to a shade of crimson that clashed violently with his expensive tan. He adjusted his cufflinks, a nervous habit masked as a power move, and cleared his throat, a sharp clinical sound that cut through the lingering tension. Your Honor, he said, his voice regaining its oily smoothness, I apologize if my passion for my client's reputation appears abrasive. However, we must deal in the reality of stature. My client, Mr. Sterling, is a man whose shadow provides shade for half the businesses in this district. He is a benefactor, a visionary, and then we have Ms. Miller. He gestured toward Sarah as if she were a smudge on a window he was trying to look through. A woman who spends her days singing rhyme nurseries and wiping finger paint off desks. Are we honestly expected to believe that her recollection of a private conversation carries the same legal weight as a documented corporate history? She claims my client threatens her livelihood. She claims he used his seat on the city council to pressure the school board into non-renewal of her contract. But where is the evidence? All we have is the emotional testimony of a woman who is clearly overwhelmed by a world she simply does not understand. I watched Sarah closely. She didn't look down this time. There was a flicker of something new in her eyes, not just the fear I had seen earlier, but a quiet, burning indignity. That is the moment I always look for as a judge. It's the emotional kill zone for the arrogant. It's the moment the victim realizes that the truth is the only weapon they need to dismantle a giant. Thorne pulled a thick, leather-bound folder from his briefcase. I have here affidavits from 3 city council members, Your Honor. All of them testify to Mr. Sterling's unimpeachable character. We have the official minutes from the school board meeting, which state clearly that Ms. Miller's contract was not renewed due to budgetary realignments. This lawsuit is a necessity. It is an act of hygiene to clear a great man's name from the mud of a disgruntled teacher's imagination. I leaned forward, the leather of my chair creaking, a sound that, in my experience, commands more silence than the loudest gavel. I looked Thorne dead in the eye, ignoring the simulated authority of his expensive suit. Mr. Thorne, I said, my voice cold enough to frost the glass on the water pitcher, you've spent the last 10 minutes telling me who your client is and 0 minutes telling me what he did. You speak of nursery rhymes as if shaping the minds of the next generation is a hobby for the simple-minded. Let me remind you, in this courtroom, a CEO's signature and a teacher's words are measured on the exact same scale of justice. The gallery shifted. A few people nodded. Thorne's jaw tightened. Now, I continued, you mentioned the school board meeting. You claim Mr. Sterling had no influence, but tell me, Mr. Thorne, why was your client, a man with no children in the district and no official role in education, present in the executive session of that board meeting just 20 minutes before the vote was taken. Thorne hesitated. It was only a fraction of a second, but in a courtroom, a second of silence is an admission of guilt. He was there as a private consultant on land development, Your Honor, entirely within his rights. A consultant, I repeated, letting the word hang in the air like a bad smell. I looked at the secondary file Sarah had submitted, the one Thorne's team had tried to suppress as irrelevant. It contains a single transcript of a voicemail left on Sarah's phone the night before her firing. Thorne didn't know I had already read the transcript. He didn't know that the one sentence that would end his career was about to be read aloud. He was still smiling, still confident in his illusion of stature, while the floor was already beginning to vanish beneath his feet. I picked up the transcript Sarah Miller had provided. It was a single sheet of paper, slightly wrinkled at the edges as if it had been held tightly for a long time. Julian Thorne watched my hands with the intensity of a hawk, but I could see a bead of sweat forming just below his perfectly manicured hairline. He knew what was in that folder, even if he had spent thousands of dollars in legal fees trying to convince himself it didn't exist. Mr. Thorne, I began, my voice echoing in the sudden expectant silence of the room. You spoke earlier about hygiene. You said this lawsuit was an act of clearing a great man's name from the mud. So let's look at the mud. I turned the paper towards him. This is a transcript of a voicemail left on Ms. Miller's personal phone at 11:42 p.m. on the night the school board met, a night when your client was supposedly acting as a private consultant on land development. Thorne straightened his back, attempting to reclaim his simulated authority. Your Honor, that recording was never authenticated. It's a digital ghost, easily manipulated by a disgruntled employee. It shouldn't even be on your bench. Authentication is for the jury, Mr. Thorne. I snapped, the sound of my voice like a gavel strike. Right now, I am concerned with the conduct of an officer of the court. Because in this transcript, the caller, who identifies himself quite clearly, doesn't mention land development. He doesn't mention budgets. He tells Ms. Miller that the world is small for people who don't know their place, and that by tomorrow morning, her place will be the unemployment line, unless she dropped her complaint about the zoning violations at the Sterling construction site. The courtroom didn't just go quiet, it went cold. I looked at the gallery. The everyday folks, the plumbers, the teachers, the retired couples who have seen enough of the world to know how it usually works, were leaning forward. This was the emotional kill zone. They weren't just watching a trial. They were watching the mask of a monster being peeled back in real time. Julian Thorne didn't have a witty return this time. His mouth opened, then closed, a fish out of water in a suit that costs more than a teacher's car. He looked toward his client, Mr. Sterling, who was sitting in the front row. Sterling wasn't looking back. He was staring at the floor, his face a mask of calculated indifference that was rapidly crumbling into panic. Mr. Thorne, I continued, leaning over the bench until I was just a few feet from his face, you called Ms. Miller a small person. You suggested she couldn't understand the world your client operates in, but it seems she understood it perfectly. She understood that power doesn't always come in a suit. Sometimes it comes in the form of a truth that no amount of money can erase. I saw Sarah Miller lifting her head. The shaking in her hands had stopped. She wasn't the victim anymore. She was the witness to a crime of arrogance. Thorne tried one last desperate gambit. He slammed his hand on the mahogany table. This is an ambush. This court is being turned into a circus of emotions. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The only one performing, Mr. Thorne, is you, and your act is over. I am calling a 10-minute recess. When we return, you will explain to me why your client shouldn't be held in contempt for witness intimidation, or you can start packing your silk briefcase. As I stood up, the silence was broken only by the sound of Thorne's heavy breathing. He had come here to silence a teacher. Instead, he was the one who had run out of words. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung open, and the sound echoed like a final warning. Julian Thorne was already at his table, his fingers tapping a frantic, uneven rhythm on the mahogany. He had straightened his silk tie and smoothed his hair, but he couldn't smooth away the look of an animal trapped in his eyes. Behind him, Mr. Sterling sat like a statue made of salt, pale, brittle, and ready to crumble under the slightest pressure. I took my seat, the black robe feeling like a suit of armor. I wasn't just representing the Los Angeles Superior Court today. I was representing every small person who had ever been told their truth didn't count against a big bank account. Mr. Thorne, I said, my voice cutting through the murmurs of the gallery like a cold blade. The recess is over. I asked for an explanation regarding the voicemail. I trust you've used these 10 minutes to find an answer that doesn't involve insulting the integrity of this bench. Thorne stood up slowly. He tried to puff out his chest, attempting to reclaim that simulated authority he had used to bully Sarah Miller all morning. But the air had gone out of him. Your Honor, he began, his voice cracked before he forced it into a strained legal drone. Regardless of the meaningful content of any recording, the legal reality is clear. Under California's two-party consent laws, this transcript is inadmissible. It was obtained without my client's knowledge. It is fruit of the poisonous tree, and we move to strike it from the record entirely. It is legally illegal. He actually tried to smile, a small, desperate glimmer of hope that a technicality would save his client from the truth. He thought he had found a loophole to hide the monster behind the man, but he forgot who he was talking to. I am Judge Simpson. I don't just read the black letters of the law. I understand the spirit of justice that gives them life. Mr. Thorne, I said, and the room went so quiet you could hear the soft hum of the fluorescent lights. You are attempting to use a shield meant for the innocent as a cloak for a predator. I leaned forward, letting the emotional kill zone expand until it felt like the walls were closing in on him. You believe that if you follow the punctuation of the law, you can ignore the heartbeat of justice. You think your billing rate gives you the right to treat this courtroom like a playground for the elite. I looked at Sarah Miller. She was watching Thorne not with the fear she had shown earlier, but with a profound, quiet pity. It was the look of a woman who had found her voice and realized the man across from her was suddenly mute. Then I turned back to Thorne. I didn't need a lecture. I didn't need to shout. I just needed to strip him of the only thing he values, his illusion of being the most important person in the room. Mr. Thorne, I said, my voice echoing with the finality of a closing door, you've spent 30 years learning how to speak to win, but you never learned how to listen to the truth. And that is why, from this moment on, your silence is the only thing this court finds valuable. The courtroom didn't just go silent. It froze. That was the one sentence that stripped the rude lawyer of his power. I saw his jaw drop. I saw his hands go limp on the table. For the first time in his career, Julian Thorne had absolutely nothing left to say. He looked toward the gallery for support, but all he found were the cold, judging eyes of the everyday folks he had dismissed as unwashed. Bailiff, I said, take the transcript. We aren't just looking at a civil matter anymore. We are looking at witness intimidation and a felony in progress. And, Mr. Thorne, you will remain seated. Do not open your mouth again unless you want to join your client in a holding cell. Thorne sank into his chair, his expensive suit looking 3 sizes too big for him. The master of the room had become a spectator to his own downfall. Julian Thorne sat in his seat. The silence he had tried to impose on Sarah Miller now wrapped around him like a shroud. I didn't look at him anymore. He was a spent force, a ghost of the simulated authority he had walked in with. My gaze shifted to the man beside him, Mr. Sterling. He was leaning back, trying to maintain a posture of wealth and indifference, but I could see the twitch in his left eyelid, the way his hand gripped the armrest of the mahogany chair until his knuckles were white as bone. He was a man used to be the benefactor and the visionary, but in my court, he was just another defendant whose shadow had finally caught up to him. Mr. Sterling, I said, my voice resonating with a weight that made the gallery hold its breath. Stand up. He hesitated, looking at Thorne for help. But Thorne was staring at a scratch on the table. Sterling rose slowly, adjusting his custom-tailored jacket as if the fabric could protect him from the truth. Your Honor, he said, his voice forced into a calm he didn't feel. I am a busy man. I have projects that provide thousands of jobs. If my attorney made a procedural error, This isn't a procedural error, Mr. Sterling, I interrupted, the sound of my voice cutting through his excuse like a strike of lightning. This is a moral rot. You speak through your attorney about budgetary realignments. You speak about land development. But let's talk about what Sarah Miller actually saw. Let's talk about the mud you wanted to bury her in. I pulled the secondary file forward. This was the moment of accountability. I looked at Sarah. She was sitting straight now, her eyes fixed on the man who had tried to erase her career. I began to read from the zoning reports she had uncovered. Reports that Mr. Sterling had tried to suppress through his consultation with the school board. Ms. Miller didn't just misunderstand a conversation, I said, turning my eyes back to Sterling. She discovered that your new luxury development was cutting corners on environmental safety, corners that put the elementary school's water supply at risk. She didn't come after you for money. She came after you because she's a teacher, and her job is to protect the children you were willing to poison for a higher profit margin. The gallery erupted in a low, angry murmur. This was the emotional kill zone. The everyday folks, the parents, the neighbors, the workers, weren't just hearing about a contract dispute anymore. They were hearing about a betrayal of the community's trust. I saw a mother in the third row clutching her child's hand tighter. I saw an old man shaking his head in disgust. Sterling's face went from pale to a sickly gray. That is, those reports are proprietary information, he stammered, his illusion of stature vanishing in real time. They are evidence of a crime, I countered, my voice low and dangerous. You didn't just try to fire a teacher. You tried to silence a whistleblower using the very board that is supposed to serve the public. You used your stature like a club to beat down a woman whose only crime was caring more about her students than your dividends. I looked at Thorne, then back to Sterling. They were both trapped in the wreckage of their own arrogance. You thought this courtroom was a place where you could buy a result. You thought Judge Simpson was someone you could manipulate with a fancy tie and a list of affidavits. But you forgot one thing. The truth doesn't have a price tag, and justice doesn't care about your zip code. I felt the power in the room shift entirely. Sarah Miller was no longer the small person Thorne had mocked. She was the giant. And as I looked at Sterling, I knew the one sentence I had delivered to his lawyer was just the beginning of the reckoning that was about to fall on his empire. The silence that followed my revelation of the environmental reports wasn't just quiet, it was heavy, like the air before a lightning strike. I looked down at the bench, at the symbols of my office, and then I looked at Sarah Miller. She was sitting perfectly still, her face no longer pale, but glowing with the quiet strength of someone who had survived the fire and came out forged in steel. Then I turned my gaze to the defense table. Julian Thorne looked like a man who had been hollowed out. His silk suit, his simulated authority, his silver-tongued arrogance, it had all evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a scared man in an expensive chair. This court has heard enough, I said, and the sound of my voice felt like a closing door. Mr. Thorne, you came here today claiming that your client's reputation was impeccable. You claimed that Sarah Miller was a small person whose words carried no weight. But you didn't realize that in this courtroom we don't weigh people by their bank accounts. We weigh them by their integrity, and your client's integrity is currently in the negatives. I reached for my gavel, but I didn't strike it yet. I wanted them to feel the weight of the moment. I wanted every person in that gallery to understand that the one sentence I had delivered earlier wasn't just about silencing a rude lawyer. It was about restoring the balance of justice. First, I began, the words measured and cold. The defamation lawsuit filed by Mr. Sterling against Ms. Miller is dismissed with prejudice. It is not only meritless, it is a malicious abuse of the legal system. Second, I am ordering Mr. Sterling to pay immediate restitution to Ms. Miller in the amount of $500,000 for emotional distress and the loss of her livelihood. Sterling tried to gasp, his mouth opening like a fish, but I cut him off before a single sound could escape. Do not speak, Mr. Sterling. You've used your voice to threaten and intimidate for long enough. Today, your money will finally serve a purpose that benefits someone other than yourself. I shifted my focus to Julian Thorne. This was the part he feared most. For a man like him, losing a case is a bruise, but losing his stature is a death sentence. Mr. Thorne, you are an officer of this court. You had a duty to the truth, and you traded it for a retainer fee. I am formally referring your conduct to the state bar for a full disciplinary review. Your attempt to suppress evidence of a crime and your complicity in witness intimidation will not be ignored. Thorne's head dropped. The man who had entered the room like a king was now sitting like a convict. This was the emotional kill zone. The gallery wasn't cheering. They were breathing again. They were watching the Simpson effect in real time. The moment where the narrative of power is replaced by the reality of accountability. But we aren't done, I continued, my voice rising just enough to command every ear in the building. The zoning violations and the threat to the public water supply mentioned in these reports are being forwarded immediately to the district attorney's office. Mr. Sterling, you won't just be paying Ms. Miller. You will be answering to the people of this city for the danger you created. Bailiff, please take Mr. Sterling into custody. He is to be held for questioning regarding the felony witness detained recorded on that voicemail. As the handcuffs clicked behind Sterling's back, the sound was louder than any gavel strike. The empire built on land development and executive sessions had finally hit a wall. I looked at Sarah Miller and gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. She had walked in a victim, but she was walking out a hero. Julian Thorne was still frozen, a silent monument to the arrogance that had destroyed him. The heavy oak doors of the Los Angeles Superior Court finally opened shut, the sound echoing through the now empty hallway. I sat alone at the bench for a long moment, the silence of the room a stark contrast to the storm that had just passed. The chairs in the gallery were straight, the transcripts were filed, and the air smelled faintly of Julian Thorne's expensive cologne, a lingering ghost of an arrogance that no longer held any power here. I looked down at my hands, resting on the mahogany surface, and I thought about the difference between a title and a truth. In 30 years, I've seen men like Julian Thorne enter this room hundreds of times. They walk in with their simulated authority, draped in silk and confidence, believing that the law is a piano they can play to any tune they desire as long as they have the right fee. They look at people like Sarah Miller, the teachers, the plumbers, the quiet neighbors, and they see small people. They see targets. They forget that the law wasn't built to be a trophy for the strong. It was built to be a shield for the weak. Sarah Miller had walked out of this room 20 minutes ago. She didn't leave with a smirk or a boast. She left with a quiet, steady peace in her eyes. The $500,000 in restitution would fix her bank account. But the look on Julian Thorne's face when he realized his silence was his only value, that is what fixed her spirit. She went back to her classroom, back to the nursery rhymes that Thorne had mocked, but she went back knowing that her voice carried more weight than all the corporate affidavits in the city. This is what I call the Simpson effect. It's the moment when the narrative of power is stripped away, and we are left with nothing but the raw, unvarnished accountability of our actions. Justice isn't always loud. It isn't always a dramatic arrest or a shouted confession. Sometimes justice is simply the sound of an arrogant man running out of words. It is the steady, quiet realization that in a court of law, your zip code and your custom-tailored jacket do not grant you immunity from being a decent human being. Julian Thorne will likely never argue a case in this room again. His stature turned out to be a hollow shell, crushed the moment it hit the wall of a teacher's integrity. Mr. Sterling will find that land development is much harder to manage from a holding cell. They both learned the most expensive lesson of their lives. You can buy influence, you can buy time, but you cannot buy the truth from a judge who knows how to listen. I stood up, my black robe rustling in the quiet. My final thought was for you, the everyday folks who watch these stories and wonder if the world is still fair. Remember this, the loudest voice is rarely the right one. Power without integrity is just a suit without a soul. As I walked toward my chambers, I knew that tomorrow the doors would open again, a new case would be called, and I would be here, waiting to see who else thinks they are above the law and who else is ready to find their voice. Because in Judge Simpson's court, the truth is the only thing that never goes silent.